And now an anti-Islam leader of a far-right party in the Netherlands is set to become the country's next Prime Minister.
Geert Wilders is one of Europe's most controversial politicians for his statements targeting immigrants and Muslim communities.
It follows a number of shock election results in the past year for right-wing populists in Argentina and Italy. So today we're asking, is a rise of the right inevitable?
Well, joining us in the studio is the leader of the True and Fair Party, Gina, who thinks the rise of the far right is slowly coming to an end. And we're also joined by former UKIP MEP Roger Helmer, who thinks voters have become disillusioned with mainstream political parties. Gina, that's really interesting. You think, because we are seeing this across Europe, aren't we, a move to the right. In that introduction, I said, do you think it's coming to an end?
I think there's a possibility for it to come to the end if the progressives and the centre actually speak up and become more courageous, because this didn't happen overnight. It actually started back in the 1980s, and too many leaders actually thought it was something that would pass, and they didn't take seriously the underlying issues that were being fueling this and being brought to the fore. You know, it was anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, anti-Europe. More recently, it's been about culture wars, the threat of AI, the threat of climate change. So they haven't been courageous enough, and I think if they are, and they don't just adopt the clothing of the right and the rhetoric, then they actually is a chance, but they have to offer a vision of the future.
That's a very good point, though, isn't it? Because we've got this process of normalisation on two sides here. So we have the centre-right adopting far-right talking points in order to win votes. And we've got the far right. Let's look at the example of Geert Wilders in this last week, moderating some more extreme views in order not to repel voters. So how do we know where
everyone's confused, but the thing is, be it the far right or the progressives, at the moment they're playing for people's votes. And I think that's completely wrong, because what they're doing is missing the underlying issues. And if they carry on like this, then there will be more of a rise of the right. But we've got to address, I mean, Starmer at the moment could come to power by just, you know, keeping his head down. But if he comes in and doesn't have a really strong, hopeful vision for the future, and he's just a better manager, then that's not good enough for the second half of this decade.
No, Roger, let's bring you in now, if we can. There is no doubt, as I said to Gina, across Europe, people are turning to more right-wing parties. I think there is a real sense, and we talked about this earlier, that in this country, in terms of immigration, when you have 745,000 people coming to this country, or indeed a city the size of Birmingham over 2 years, people are saying, I don't recognise this country, I don't like what's happening, it's too fast. And that is, I think, why people are changing the way they vote.
Well, I think that's a very fair analysis. What you've got certainly in Britain is you've got two major parties who have drifted together to the centre until you can hardly get a cigarette paper between them. They both want big government. They both want high taxes. They're both very relaxed about immigration. They're both pushing the net zero agenda and global warming. The two parties look like twin brothers almost. And as a result, people are looking for alternatives. Now, the left doesn't really offer those alternatives, because we know the left tends to be committed to immigration and net zero and so on. So naturally, people look in the other direction. The other point I think is critically important. If you go back, say, 10 years ago, politicians were terrified of drawing a link between high levels of immigration on the one hand and pressure on infrastructure, pressure on social services on the other hand. Now I think it's becoming something that is understood not only by politicians but by the general public, people who can't get to see a GP. There are too many people. And the other aspect, you've mentioned the cultural aspects of it. We've heard there are 700 and something thousand net immigrants in the previous year. But what we should be looking at from a cultural point of view is over 1 million incomers coming, many of them, most of them, I think, without any sort of connection to our culture. And that is threatening and dangerous. There are no attempts to integrate them into our society.
Roger, you mentioned a couple of issues there, things like not being able to get doctors' appointments, etc. I mean, if you look at the pattern from the local elections of late, what do you think are going to be the key issues on the doorstep in the run-up to the election? Is it going to be the government talking about small boats and migration, or is it about the issues that directly affect people in their pockets, the cost of living crisis, for example?
Well, to an extent, it's both. I think the government would be very unwise to talk too much about small boats, because literally for years and years and years, they have promised to get a handle on this whole immigration issue, both the illegal immigration and the total immigration. Every election, they promise to get it sorted out. And what do we see? The figures simply go up and up and up. So people just don't believe those promises anymore. But at the same time, you're absolutely right that people are very worried about the cost of living, the standard of living, levels of taxation. They don't like those things at all. The concern, and thank heavens I'm not planning a campaign for the Conservatives, because I simply don't know what they would say about these issues that would be credible and that would communicate effectively on the doorstep.
I'm not sure you're the only one scratching your head on that one.
And Gina, doesn't Roger make a really important point there, which is the Labour Party and the Conservative Party are almost indistinguishable. I don't think you can put a cigarette paper between them. What does it mean for parties like yours? Because I think people are searching for something new, for something different.
They absolutely are. And, on the doorstep, people call Labour Tory light. So, that's literally what they're saying. I want to come back on something that Roger said, and this discussion on the migration figures. Because the fact is, when we were part of Europe, people didn't take note of it. And we didn't really know how many people were coming and going. We didn't have that data because of free movement. Yeah. And what we discovered when we Brexited is that we needed people in all these sectors. So to have our country functioning, we needed to bring in more people. And that's where the politicians have failed. And I think the progressive politicians we have not trained enough people here in the country. We have not invested in infrastructure. Do you remember after the financial crisis when George Osborne said, we were going to fix the roofs while the sun shone? Well, they didn't. No. So poor leadership is actually a big part of this rise in the right.
And can I just bring you in, Roger? You were an MEP in Brussels. I was an MEP in Brussels as well. That Gina is absolutely right. It's a failure of governance. The whole point was to take back control of our money, laws and borders. The shockwaves across the EU this morning will be monumental, because he's also talked about Nexit. If they had bothered to listen to the UK and the reforms that we wanted to the EU, we may well have stayed in it.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Many of us who campaigned for Brexit would have said, if we were only talking about a free trade area, we would support it. I remember the first debate I ever got into on this issue at the age of 16 at school. I was in favour of joining the then European Economic Community, because I believed it was about trade and jobs. And if it was about trade and jobs, fine. It was the fact that Brussels was trying to take day-to-day management control of virtually all the member states, I think that was upsetting us. But can I just raise one other point? I'm interested that those on the left are called progressives and those on the right are called far right. So we've shifted the language to make the left sound good and cuddly and make the right sound bad.
I don't like these old right and left terms, but I mean,
I'm glad you're not on the left and certainly not on the far right either.
No, that's why I call progressive. But you're right on the doorstep. People are asking for something different. And what is really going to be really interesting at the next election here in the UK is if people turn out to vote, because actually that is the biggest growing figure. What I hear all the time is people saying, "What's the point? They're all the same." And so that's what we're saying. The True and Fair Party, we have to have a vision for the future that deals with AI, the threat to the workforce, to climate change. We have to offer people lifelong learning. We have to offer them hope. And we're not doing that at the moment.